Transform all your company's milestones, big or small, into impact with Impact Hero. Whether it's a sale, a new hire, a demo booked, or anything else, with Impact Hero, you automatically generate a gift that matters, like a tree planted, a kilo of plastic recovered, or a piece of coral reef restored. Join the hundreds of companies that are already boosting sales and retention while making an impact. Go to impacthero.com/podcast now to get 10% off. Again, that's impacthero.com/podcast to get 10% off. Welcome to another ClimateTech podcast, interviews with the people trying to save us from ourselves. I'm not easily starstruck, but getting to meet Bruce Friedrich, founder of the Good Food Institute, is a really big deal for me. As you'll hear in this episode, it's because of him that I'm involved in the food tech space at all. Bruce dispenses Yoda-like wisdom with Buddha-like compassion and is, as far as I'm concerned, the most influential voice on the future of food. I reached him in Washington, D.C. I'm Ryan Grant Little. Thanks for being here. Bruce, it's really a true honor to have you on this podcast. I'm thrilled that you're here.
I am absolutely delighted to be here, Ryan. I appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
So you are the founder and president of the Good Food Institute, or GFI, as we'll be calling it throughout the podcast. You've written op-eds for the Wall Street Journal, for Guardian, for USA Today, for the Los Angeles Times, for Wired, CNN, Foreign Policy. I could go on and on. These are just some that I was able to find. You've been on some slightly more famous podcasts than this one, the New Yorker Radio Hour, Recode, Decode, the Ezra Klein Show, Making Sense with Sam Harris. I'm a subscriber to all of these. And you also have a TED Talk that's been viewed at this point more than 2.3 million times. So my question for you is, with all of these outlets and, talking through all of these different media outlets, what is GFI trying to say?
Thanks very much, Ryan. That's a great opening question. So GFI's mission is to create a world where alternative proteins are no longer alternative. We've got 27 years until we're in 2050. Over the last 27 years, meat production has gone up more than 80%. It is predicted to go up somewhere between 60 and more than 100% by 2050. It is already the case, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that unless meat production goes down, Paris climate goals are going to be impossible. The meat industry will eat up the entirety of our carbon budget. And despite an awful lot of conversation around food systems, the only things that anybody is doing to try to change the massive upward trajectory, one is convince people to eat less meat, and two is alternative proteins. I am a fan of educating people about the external costs of meat production. I'll just note that we've been doing that for well north of 50 years. It's not obvious how those efforts, even if they're wildly successful, it's not obvious how they scale. And so far, I'm sure they've made a dent. I think they're important. They're why I'm here. They're why people start companies in this space, a lot of people in this space. But at the end of the day, I think the only way we decrease the production of industrial animal meat and keep humanity within the Paris climate targets is if we shift meat production to plant-based and cultivated meat. And I'm happy to dive into some of the science and numbers, or not, as you like. But that's one of the central questions. And I'll say there's a similar story to be told about antimicrobial resistance, about pandemic risk, about cruelty to animals, about biodiversity loss. Like, all of these things are significantly exacerbated by meat production and consumption. And out of 11 peer-reviewed studies, the lowest prediction for meat in 2050 is 62% more. Alternative proteins is basically, it's like renewable energy. It's like electric vehicles. We know the world is going to consume more energy inexorably through 2050. We know the world is going to travel more and buy more cars and other vehicles. Part of the solution is energy efficiency to fossil fuels. Part of the solution is encouraging people to walk and consume less energy, and walkable cities and great public transit. But part of the solution has to be renewable energy and electric vehicles. So too here. Part of the solution has to be making meat from plants, cultivating meat from cells, which causes a fraction of the climate change and uses a fraction of the amount of land.
What you're pointing out there is we can tell people to stop, or we can make it easier for them to do something else. And one of the things I love about alternative protein space, and people who listen to the podcast know that I'm an investor in the space, is that you can remove all this negative stuff about the food industry, but without affecting the end user's experience, right? And so the fact of the cow and the slaughter of the cow is not an intrinsic part of the enjoyment of a hamburger, and it could actually be a detractor, and it could also, it has lots of downsides, as we can probably guess. But if we can replicate the taste, the price, and the accessibility, and I think, and I know GFI agrees, because I just had your managing director of Europe speaking at an event that I hosted here in Vienna. I know that these are the three holy grails for me: taste, price, and accessibility. But if we can kind of mimic these or improve on these, of that hamburger through alternative proteins, we've won the battle for the consumer, right? So this is, I think it's easier. It's an easier win to just give someone something else that actually is better for them, in every possible way. Do you feel like we're at the precipice of this, or that the tipping point is coming soon, where from the consumer's perspective, and I'm not talking about vegans and vegetarians here, but I mean for carnivores out there, do you think we're coming up to the point where, what is it in AI? We talk about singularity, maybe alternative protein singularity moment where it tastes just as good to them?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about hitting the S curve, and yes, you're exactly right. In the same way that the way that renewable energy becomes successful is it solves intermittency and the price comes down to parity or less, because people are not going to pay more for energy, but they're also not going to pay less, more. I'm sorry, they're not going to pay more for fossil fuels. They're also not going to pay more for solar. So as long as you satisfy consumers in terms of energy production, renewables can win, but they only win if you satisfy consumers. Same thing with electric vehicles. Consumers are by and large, not going to buy an EV if the battery range is 115 kilometers and there's no charging infrastructure. So you need to satisfy battery range and charging infrastructure. And you hit on GFI's precise theory of change on this issue, which is that the main things that dominate consumer choice where meat is concerned are, is it delicious and is it affordable? So we need to get to price and taste parity for plant-based and cultivated meat. And that's pretty much our focus. And it's worth noting that that is a very new endeavor. On the plant-based meat side, it really was Ethan Brown and Pat Brown, no relation, that started companies in 2009 and 2011 that first had the brainstorm. Hey, meat is made up of protein, fat, minerals, and water. Plants also have protein, fat, minerals, and water. What would it look like for us to precisely replicate the meat experience for the consumer using plants? And because it is so much more efficient, all of the things that make it such a boon from a land use, resource use, climate, et cetera, vantage also make it a colossal economic opportunity. So what would it look like to do that and see the entire population of the world that eats as our consumer base, not flexitarians, vegetarians? And then with cultivated meat, it's basically, you can take a seed from a plant or a cutting from a plant, and you can bathe the seed or the cutting in nutrients, and it will grow into a full plant. You can do that same thing with a small sampling of cells from a chicken or a pig or a fish. And again, it's a fraction of the climate change, a fraction of the water, fraction of the land, whether you're talking about aquaculture fish or chickens or pigs. And because it's so much more efficient, as it scales up, the price will come down. What we believe to be true in response to your question is that when we hit price and taste parity and lean in on the nutrition advantages of both of these ways of producing meat, we will see a significant shoot up the S curve. But predicting when we get to price and taste parity is going to be very, very difficult. It is going to be a function of whether we can win government support, both for the science of replicating the precise meat experience at price parity, and then also to get the startups across the valley of death. So the same sorts of programs that the Biden administration passed here in the big climate bill, the incentives for scaling of renewable energy and electric vehicles, we need those same sorts of incentives for alternative proteins. And we're optimistic those things are coming and the research is happening. It needs to be a lot more than it is so far. And we're moving in that direction, but it's just really, it's early enough in the trajectory of the science and the scaling that it's tough to predict precisely when we'll hit the S-curve.
But it's late enough that it's getting the attention of lobbyists from big ag and dairy and that type of thing. So it's not just about incentives from governments, but it's about governments actually not standing in the way. You mentioned cultivated meat, so real meat grown from animal cells minus the animal. Lots of stuff happening there from the scientific perspective, from the commercial perspective. Investment took a dip for a little while, but there are some big deals that are happening again just in the past couple of weeks. But the big story at the moment is watching governments and some, Britain and Germany making investments into this space. Italy, Poland, potentially we'll see how this changes now that Donald Tusk is prime minister there and if this gets reversed. But some countries, here in Europe pushing against it. Austria, where I am, I've just done a big post with Ivo from your organization with his fact sheet, hoping that the Austrian government here will look at the science behind it and not go the way kind of Italy. But so what's going on? Why has cultivated meat become this electric rail, just, the electrified third rail of alternative proteins right now? And is this a coincidence, or is this lobbyists kind of lining up and working together in concert?
I mean, I definitely think there's some degree of a sort of viral nature to it. It's confusing, and it's surprising that this would be a priority for some European governments. It's, we are in the US, we've been successful in keeping this as a bipartisan issue. We're focusing on the fact that this is jobs in the heartland, it's choices for consumers, it's choices for farmers, it's global economic competitiveness. So the Center for Strategic and International Studies did a report that was focused on the US government. And in addition to talking about the climate, biodiversity, AMR, pandemic benefits of shifting toward alternative proteins, their director of global food and water security and their director of energy and climate co-authored a report on alternative proteins. And they said that this is about food systems resilience and economic competitiveness. And they recommended that the US government prioritize its alternative protein industry in the same way the US government prioritizes biopharma, clean energy, and advanced chips for for artificial intelligence. So they're really leaning in. If this is going to be so much more efficient, it is consequently going to be extraordinarily lucrative. And the US lost the EV battery race. They lost the solar panel race. The US has 4 gigafactories for lithium-ion batteries. China has north of 100. The US, I think, now makes something like 1% of our solar panels. I think 80% of them come from Asia, something like 60% from China. So this is a massive manufacturing, jobs, and economic activity endeavor. And it really is the sort of thing that governments that fight this industry are going to lose over both the short and medium term, and absolutely over the long term. So it's unfortunate, and it's going to be really counterproductive for industry and for farmers.
Also feels like this cognitive dissonance with the meat industry and big ag in general, where I feel like they're both trying to embrace and eviscerate the alternative proteins industry at the same time. And some of them are investing in the space while also lobbying against it. Is this just the kind of the sign of the transitionary time that we're in? I mean, I know both, GFI and it's my view as well that we need these big companies to come along with us. We're not trying to put them out of business. We're trying to just, change the input for their protein rather than kind of remove them altogether. And you've got a front row seat to all of this. What are you seeing? What are your thoughts on some of these big, meat companies and traditional ag companies?
Well, I don't think the meat companies and the traditional ag companies are doing anything unsupportive of alternative proteins. I do think it's, there's a degree to which it's anti-tech activists, which is ironic because the things that they purport to care about are going to be literally impossible if we need to produce 70% more industrial animal agriculture. But there's a strain of sort of food activist that is happy to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so they just keep their eyes on the prize of perfection and consequently oppose anything that basically is not anti-capitalist. So if you are working with the meat industry and the food industry, there's a little bit of the friend of my enemy is my enemy element to it. So that's some of the just sort of anti-tech, anti-capitalism food activists. And then there is, I think, in places like Italy and Poland, it's the farm lobby, not the meat industry. So ADM and Cargill both sponsor our big annual conference at the gold level. So did Givaudan, with a focus on their Mista brand. All of the major meat and food companies are investing in both plant-based and cultivated meat. And we work with these companies. We work with their lobbyists. I don't think any of them. I mean, obviously, the bulk of their profits come from the current system. So they're not going to do things to, break themselves up, and they're not going to do things that are going to harm what is the bulk of their profits. But they're certainly not doing anything antagonistic to plant-based and cultivated meat. They recognize, they are in the process of producing protein profitably, and they see this as likely to allow them to produce protein even more profitably than they are now. But yeah, there are different parts of the farm sector, different parts of the meat industry. And it's definitely my strong impression that it's not the incumbent meat industry that is behind any of the anti-alternative protein work.
Interesting. Okay, so it's much more on the farm and sort of the dairy lobby and coming from these through these checkoff programs and that type of thing. You just came back from COP28, which ended today, the day that we're recording this. And speaking of lobbyists, so last year there were 120 registered food industry lobbyists. This year there were 350 or something like that, in that order of magnitude. So we're talking about triple. I wonder if you felt that kind of presence there. And I wonder also what everybody's kind of surprised and sort of hesitantly or cautiously celebrating today that 200 countries have agreed to transition away from carbon-based oil and gas economies. No clarity on kind of when or how necessarily, but still in 30 years, it's the first time that they've said that. But we're always focused on this kind of carbon question and not necessarily some of the other things like, oil and gas always gets the front row, and the food industry might need a little bit more visibility as well. What are your impressions of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's been perplexing to us just sort of generally how little the global policy community that's focused on the Paris Climate Agreement takes into account food. And I remember a couple of years ago, Bill Gates said that until alternative proteins came along, everybody was just scratching their head because there wasn't anything else that scaled. So, we're back to my renewable energy and electric vehicles analogy, where if you're doing something, you look at the trajectory of how solar got cheap. There's literally a book by, I think, exactly that title, and it talks about the science and scaling that started in the US, then moved to Germany, then moved to Japan, then moved to China. And it really was the story of not exactly cooperation, but it was a story of science anywhere can scale to everywhere. Scale up capacity anywhere can scale to everywhere. And the climate community has not seen anything like that in food until alternative proteins came along. And so, GFI is an example. We have 6 GFIs around the world. We have GFI US, and then we also have India, Israel, Brazil, Asia Pacific based out of Singapore, and Europe. We operate at the EC level in Brussels, and then we also operate in the UK and Germany. Our central goal organizationally is we are a science think tank. We have about 215 full-time team members. The plurality of our team members around the world are scientists. And there's a little of a sort of chicken eggy thing because our goal is to create the most robust scientific ecosystem possible. We're pretty sure the way that happens is through government support for science. So we literally have 2 metrics, just 2, that caused us to figure out the 6 areas of the world that we want to operate in. The first one is, does the government fund a lot of science? And the second is, are there world-class scientific institutions to take that money? And so our global battle cry is that government should be funding the transition with a view toward recognizing, we're not in Singapore because we care what people in Singapore eat. We're there because they have government that cares a lot about food security. This is a huge food security solution. The government recognizes that and they're leaning in, and they have world-class science institutions. So far, the global policy climate community has not even been hand-wavy about the problem of increased meat production. So the IPCC has recognized, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has recognized that unless meat production goes down, it's not going to be possible to meet Paris Climate Agreement goals. And it has literally no plan. There's not anything hand-wavy. There's not anything that they're saying might work. They just go, meat production needs to go down. Similarly, their methane targets are just completely impossible unless ruminant production goes down. And yet they're not even hand wavy about what it might look like for that to happen. But we're making inroads. This COP, for the first time ever, the Emirates have a declaration on sustainable agriculture, resilient food systems, and climate action. Something I think 156 maybe governments so far and counting have signed on to add agriculture to their nationally determined contributions. First time that's ever happened. I had an entire day focused on food. First time that's ever happened. Kudos to Mariam El-Mari, who is the Climate and Environment Minister for the UAE. At every available opportunity, she was talking about alternative proteins and food. And so, yeah, I'm optimistic that we turned a corner at this COP in terms of both putting food systems onto the agenda, and then that will allow us to point out that, yes, there are many different things that need to happen in food systems. Alternative proteins are not a silver bullet. They don't solve every problem, but it does look like they're the one food systems intervention that scales. So they absolutely need to be a part of food systems transformation. And we can chat about some of the science and work that's been done that proves or at least strongly points in the direction of what I just said, or we can go wherever you would like to go. I feel like I'm doing quite a bit of monologuing, and I apologize.
I'm so happy to have you on this podcast and to just if I could just download your brain onto an episode, I would be very happy. It feels also like, you've talked a lot about solar and electric cars, and maybe this is just an impression, maybe there's some recency bias or something, but when I look at your post and some of the stuff coming from GFI, it feels like you're more and more using metaphors to those types of clean tech that people might be more used to kind of make the point about alternative proteins. So maybe, and I do this a lot as well when I'm talking to university students or to different groups, because people don't really, people think of Teslas and they think of solar panels, and that's kind of climate tech for the average person. They're definitely not thinking about veggie burgers, right? And so I'm looking for ways to bring this in. I wonder, is this a conscious choice that you're trying to kind of use these analogs or metaphors?
Yeah, we've gotten a lot of positive affirmation from some of our successes by leaning into this concept. And there have been a lot of reports and analyses by economists that really lean into the idea that the amount of mitigation that's available here, the amount of land that's going to be spared, is actually significantly greater than a complete shift to electric vehicles from gas-powered cars. Even at 50% plant-based meat, according to a peer review article in Nature Communications, you're talking about 4 times the impact at 50% plant-based meat of grounding every single airplane on the planet. So that's before you even get to the sequestration benefits, which double the mitigation benefits. Those kinds of comparisons and analogies really do resonate with people. I remember I was doing an interview for NPR, National Public Radio in the United States, which is on it's millions and millions and millions of listeners. And the reporter had asked me not to use lots of numbers, not to use lots of statistics, which is something that I almost inevitably do as a rule. I've known her for a while. And she's like, Bruce, I need you to just talk, I need you to give me the 10,000 feet. And at the end of the interview, I said, I really do just need to tell you that Boston Consulting Group said that at 10% plant-based meat, it would be the equivalent of grounding every single plane on the planet. And they led with that in the NPR story. And then she subsequently did a story for the CBS the Morning News, which is a big TV show over here. And she led with it again. So that's an indication that even people who are allergic to statistics and talking in terms of gigatonnage like these kinds of comparisons.
I love that. I want to shift gears a little bit. So we've talked a fair bit about GFI, about alternative proteins. I'm curious about you as well as Bruce. In an earlier part of your career, you were an animal rights activist in the more traditional sense. But these days, you're much more likely to be talking about market forces and policymaking over Zoom. And I wonder how your approach to activism, are you still an activist? Is this a form of activism? Maybe this is advocacy is a better word? What's that journey been like for you? I work with a lot of companies who plan to open up shop in or expand across Europe. My one big piece of advice, don't fall into the trap of setting up a new entity right away. Instead, talk to my friends at Paracar, who can help you get up and running without all the costs, not to mention the legal and HR hassle. When I was hiring in different EU countries, I wanted my team to focus on their work, not on the country's bureaucracy. After interviewing a half dozen international expansion firms, I chose Paracar because they were by far the most knowledgeable and they're great people. Whether you're a large multinational looking to expand abroad, a small business looking for the right talent, or a contractor, they'll sort it out. Book a free, no-obligation consultation right now at paracar.eu/climate. That's PARAKAR.eu/climate.
Yeah, I mean, GFI is kind of full circle. So my first year of college, I read a book called Diet for a Small Planet by Francis Moore Lappé. The TLDR on Diet for a Small Planet is basically GFI's theory of change, more or less, or at least our reason for being. And that is that in order to eat meat, we have to feed animals lots and lots of crops. So back then, it was a fraction of what it is now. The recent numbers, one story that really resonates for me is the UN Special Envoy on Food, a guy named Jean Ziegler. In roughly 2010, he called biofuels a crime against humanity because 100 million metric tons of corn and wheat were being fed to farm animals, which was driving up the price of corn and wheat and was leading to malnutrition and starvation. And he said, this is a crime against humanity. That same year, the Guardian journalist George Monbiot pointed out 756 million metric tons of corn and wheat were being fed to farm animals. 10 years later, that number was north of 1 billion metric tons of corn and wheat, from 756 million to north of 1 billion, plus another 270 million metric tons of soy. 77% of the global soy crop is fed to farm animals. So it's literally driving up the price of food. It is requiring almost unfathomable amounts of land. Right now, 3 billion hectares of land, which is the size of China plus India times 2. If these numbers are going to go up 70 to 100% by 2050, that is what is going to make meeting our SDG goals 1 and 2, eliminate poverty, eliminate malnutrition, basically impossible. And that's the thing back 1987 that caused me to get really interested in agricultural economics. I ran a group called Poverty Action Now on my campus. We organized fasts for Oxfam International. I ended up majoring in economics, focusing on agricultural economics. Spent a year at the London School of Economics, studying structural adjustment programs. Wrote my honors thesis in college on structural adjustment programs. It was called The Dice Are Loaded. And a lot of it had to do with the idea that even when countries are suffering from starvation and malnutrition, their agricultural produce is being shipped to developed world economies to be fed to agricultural animals because of these World Bank and IMF structural adjustment programs. As the global economy has become even a more global economy with fewer tariffs, et cetera, these relationships have gotten even worse. So that was the thing that first caused me to be interested in the issues that motivate GFI now. I ran a homeless shelter and a soup kitchen for a little over 6 years in inner city Washington, D.C. And then for a while, I worked in animal protection, still with a focus on industrial animal farming. And my motivation was, in addition to animals, it was, continued to be my original motivation for caring about these issues, global starvation and just resource waste generally. And then climate change, as that became an issue as well. So I think my career trajectory has been, how do I make a positive difference in the world, largely motivated by my faith, which is pretty integral to how I make decisions, and just kind of at any given moment, looking around and asking, am I doing as much positive good in the world as I possibly can? And when I was watching what was happening with Pat Brown and Ethan Brown and Josh Tetrick, and they were saying, hey, we can make meat from plants, or in Tetrick's case, we can make eggs from plants. It'll be a lot more efficient, and consequently, we can win in the marketplace. It felt to me like a nonprofit organization focused on that, so that we're not leaving everything to the tender mercies of the individual companies that are focused on it. The idea of actually working for policy change, working for a most robust possible scientific ecosystem, and producing materials that will allow lots and lots of companies to not have to do all of the science and work in individual silos, just felt like it made tremendous sense to me.
It feels like a lot of people who dedicate their lives to service of others, there often there's a split between service to people or service to animals. And I feel like you've kind of lumped in, the Homo sapiens as just another mammal and treating us all with equal magnanimity. Is that, if I'm saying that right?
Yeah, I mean,
And
I'll just note though. I mean, the reason GFI generally we focus on climate, biodiversity, global health, and the reason for that is that governments put lots and lots of money into meeting Paris Climate Agreement goals, hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe trillions of dollars. Governments put lots of money into things like solving for antimicrobial resistance and lessening pandemic risk, trillions of dollars into dealing with COVID-19 after it happened. So being able to go to governments and say, hey, look, 70% of working medically relevant antibiotics are fed to farm animals right now, 70%. It's already killing 1.3 million people per year. You are putting, government, whatever government you're talking to, you're putting, hundreds of millions or billions of dollars into developing new drugs. What say we put some money into keeping the current antibiotics working? If we're already feeding 70% of working antibiotics to farm animals, that is going to usher in the end of working antibiotics, which the UK government has said is a more certain risk to humanity than climate change, and which the former president of the World Health Organization said will be the end of modern medicine. That can motivate governments to take the issue seriously. The economic benefits can motivate governments to take the issue seriously. Pandemic risk can motivate governments to take the issue seriously. So we really do lean, we think that this will be a lot more successful, a lot more quickly. And it may be the difference between success and failure, getting governments to lean in on the science and the scaling. So that's why we are focused on the things we're focused on. The most you can hope for from governments on animal protection is that they'll make the most egregious abuses illegal. And that even is pretty consistently harder than you would expect to make happen. So that's why we focus in the way that we do.
Yeah, I mean, I like that also. It's a very holistic view, right? Of, planetary health, human health, animal health. All of these things are very interconnected and they don't have bright lines between them. So,
yeah, that's absolutely right.
And there's a quote in one of the pieces that you've written before, which I think really captures this well. And we talk, this is a ClimateTech podcast, and, I work a lot in the investment space, and people talk a lot about technology. But fundamentally, the technology is there if we want it for a lot of these things. It's a lot more about, you mentioned faith. It's about psychology. It's about behavior. It's about things like empathy. So I just want to pick up on a quote from one of your books. To succeed in freeing people to express their compassion, to open their hearts and minds, our interactions must be rooted in empathy and understanding, working with an individual's motivations, fears, desires, and shortcomings instead of approaching with a fighting mindset. And, this is very consistent with you as a person, right? Wasn't just something you wrote down, and I follow you closely on LinkedIn and in different places. And I've seen people attack you personally, and your response most of the time is, hey, would you like to have a one-on-one phone call? And needless to say, in 2023, this isn't how most people react to getting pushback in the comments section, below the line on the article. And I just wonder, how do you manage to keep your head so level? And in particular, how do you manage to turn the temperature down on these heated moments? Where does the strength come from?
I think maybe it comes from humility. Maybe it comes from necessity. It's so I don't know if you know the Enneagram, which is sort of like a spiritual version of the Myers-Briggs, but my Enneagram number is 9. And one of the benefits of being a 9, it's the peacemaker. And one of the less noble personality traits is lack of not being thoroughly in touch with one's emotions, to put it charitably. So that means that being calm is not difficult. And so no, I don't find it difficult when somebody is excoriating me to respond kindly. And I recognize that if somebody's excoriating me, it means that they're a different personality type than I am. And that was really a revelation. Like I don't ever behave that way toward anybody else. And so when somebody first behaved that way to me, I sort of, gosh, this is what it would mean if I behaved that way, that, my head would be about to explode, and, what on earth could have provoked this? And then I realized that, different people have different ways of reacting to stress. Different people have different realities that they're living through. There are a couple of really powerful stories in Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that I think are really helpful in terms of recognizing that if somebody is having a bad day, that may manifest in ways that cause you to be really unforgiving. Or you can think about the fact that, it's significantly worse to be the person who is incredibly angry than to be the person who's receiving the anger. And it just helps to have compassion for people. Probably is another example of where attempting to live my life by, the Matthew 25 story about the works of mercy probably also is helpful. Having a prayer life, having a spiritual practice is probably also helpful. But I do think I show up with just sort of an equanimity that has both, good aspects and less good aspects.
I'm not an easily starstruck person, but this is my first time speaking with you. But you've been quite possibly the biggest influence on me in this stage of my life and career. And I'll tell you just one reason why. So actually it was because of a podcast as well. So in 2021, I was driving through Italy. I was going to be staying for a month in a remote cabin in Umbria, just with, a bunch of stuff in the trunk, my dog in the back. And you popped up on a podcast that I subscribe to, which is called People I Mostly Admire, with Stephen Levitt, who's the author of Freakonomics. And I just, the company I was working for had just been sold, and I had a bit of a payout from that. And I was thinking of what to do next. And this was, my first time learning. This was my entry point into alternative proteins in the non-consumer way of someone who buys Beyond Burgers from the, frozen aisle. And I joined about, I think, a few weeks later, the GFI conference. It was on Zoom. It was still COVID. And I loved it. I loved so many things about it. One, that it was, you could feel this energy from this being a new market. Two, that, people felt really values aligned. So people weren't in this industry just because of the money, and coming from B2B SaaS, where people definitely were just there for that for the most part. And number three, I remember seeing some panels where some people have just, raised tens of millions of dollars, and others were just kind of starting out or were kind of PhD researchers and that type of thing. And just the way people spoke at eye level and just the respect in the room, the Zoom room or whatever at that time, it was palpable. And you could really feel that there's great people working in this industry. And that was the moment that I decided to get in. And, in the past couple of years, I've invested quite a bit and tried to kind of insinuate myself in whatever way is useful and helpful into the space. So not everyone is going to listen to this podcast and kind of do the same thing and, devote their time and money to the sector. But I wonder, for people out there who want to get involved, what would be your tips for some of the first steps they can take to get involved with the solution instead of just worrying about the problem?
Well, I'll start by saying I'm incredibly moved by your kindness, Ryan. Yeah, I'm incredibly moved. That was incredibly nice to hear, and gracious of you to share. I think I think there's going to be a radically different response to the answer depending on where people are in their career trajectory. I think the main thing that I would suggest is that people do what you did, which is dive in, become acquainted with the full spectrum of the activities, familiarize yourself with the theory of change. And I think the best way to do that is going to be to sign up for some of GFI's newsletters. So if you go to gfi.org/newsletters, you'll find our US newsletters, which are global in scope, a little US centric, but we also have newsletters from GFI, India, Israel, Brazil, Singapore, and Europe. Also have e-newsletters. And if you go to gfi.org, you'll see in the upper right-hand corner, you can click on global and find the websites for each of the 6 GFIs and sign up for the other newsletters as well. I do encourage people to sign up for our monthly reports, which is at gfi.org/newsletters. You can get a sense of all the activity that GFI is working on around the world, which gives you a sense of what we think is most important. We kind of need everything. The industry is super nascent at the moment. At the end of the day, it is a scientific challenge, though. So for anybody who is a scientist or is early enough career that you can go into tissue engineering or plant biology or biotechnology or biomanufacturing. Like these are where success is going to happen. And then, of course, the flip side of that is if you're in an area where you can help to provide funding, that's obviously like philanthropic funding. I should say GFI is a charity. So we are completely and totally funded by philanthropy, all of our work. We do not take corporate donations. Corporations do lessen the cost to GFI of our conference. So we do take corporate sponsorships for the conference, but the conference does not break even. And that is the exclusive place in which we take corporate money. And then, yes, policy work would be another place in private sector, like you are funding startups, or if you going and working at a major food corporation and moving them in the direction of really leaning in on the work that they're doing on alternative proteins. But honestly, the answer is going to vary quite a lot depending on what somebody's sort of proclivities, talents, and where they are in their career.
So I'll put the links to GFI in the show notes. I'm guessing the best place to reach you or to follow you is LinkedIn.
LinkedIn is a great option.
It usually is. It's always LinkedIn, but yeah, no one says Instagram or I don't know, TikTok here.
I literally posted my first Instagram photo a couple of days ago, and I noticed that I had not updated my profile since 2018. So yeah. I set up an Instagram account in 2018 and followed a couple of GFI Instagram accounts and then kind of forgot about it. And so I went skydiving and had a photo that I quite like. So I posted a photo on Instagram, but that's the sum total of my Instagram activity over the years I've been on it.
Okay, so LinkedIn if you want to follow or get in touch with Bruce, Instagram if you want to see a picture of him skydiving 5 years ago.
No, the skydiving is like 2 weeks ago.
Oh, wow. So okay.
And I just noticed when I went to post it that I had not updated my profile since 5 years ago. So I updated my profile and posted a photo of me skydiving in Dubai like a week, roughly a week ago.
Well, look at you social media maven. Bruce, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks very much, Ryan. I'm incredibly grateful for your support, for all your work, for the podcast and everything. Really honored to be on.
Thanks for listening to another ClimateTech podcast. It would mean a lot if you would subscribe, rate, and share this podcast. Get in touch anytime with tips and guest recommendations at hello@climatetechpod.com. Find me, Ryan Grant Little, on LinkedIn. I'll be back with another episode next week. Bye for now. This episode is supported by Grizzle, B2B content to create and capture demand. I first met Grizzle's founder, Tom Watley, 5 years ago at a conference in Dublin. I was so impressed that I signed a deal with him to do all my software company's content that same evening at the pub. Remember that, Tom?
Kinda.
And they're still doing it 2 years after we sold the company because the new owners love Grizzle as much as I do. If you sell B2B, book 30 minutes in Tom's calendar at grizzle.io/climate. That's GRIZZLE.io/climate.